So yeah, I'm sorry that Gav's talk is not here, but hopefully you'll get that tomorrow, and hopefully we can entertain with some other stuff in the meantime. So really, we want to talk about ideas for Substrate, for Polkadot, for higher level things like crypto economics, and any ideas that you in the audience have for application level stuff, infrastructure stuff, tooling, whatever else is on the table to be talked about. Come with your idea and like get our opinion on it, or yeah, whatever you feel is fun to listen to. So I think we'll start out. I'm just gonna ask you two, what are some ideas that you would want in the ecosystem, like either want to have built by the community or would want to build yourself?
So in general, one thing that I think is really cool is like video streaming, like live streaming, video games, all of that kind of stuff, like in terms of doing that in a decentralized way, right? Like I mean, that comes with a whole host of other challenges, like, distribution and caching and things like that if you want to access VODs. There's also a ton of potential for people to, like make money off of that, and like you don't have Twitch, you don't have Amazon taking a cut in the end. So I think that's a pretty cool project that probably is on the horizon of what is reasonable to execute and implement if you have a solid team and a couple of years of time.
Is anyone working on gaming here in the audience?
That's the first. There's usually some crews who are doing some gaming stuff.
I know of at least one team in the Substrate ecosystem called Horizon Games. Yeah. It's working on a gaming platform, so check it out.
I think, I mean, to riff on the idea, like having a decentralized Twitch, it gets interesting in the economics, right? Because you like would you use the same token to like pay subscription fees to streamers that you would use to secure the chain, or would you split that up?
Yeah, good question. It depends really on the level of liquidity you have, how much issuance you have, whether those are locked up in the stakers' hands for a long time. I mean, theoretically, you can have a split. You probably want something that's relatively stable or relatively oracle price adjusted. You have fast price oracles for something that you're paying people with in real time, especially with state channels. So I mean, that would be either a stable coin or something that you have very fast price oracles for, and that requires like a lot of exchanging usually in order to do that, and a lot of sort of, in the case of a stable coin, a lot of crafty ways to put like sell pressure and liquidation pressure on positions to make sure that like you can have the right level of collateral. So it really depends how you do it. But if your staking token has like a high enough supply and is liquid enough, then like you could use that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the larger challenges we have seen teams have encountered over the last few years in general, when they've designed their application and said like, oh yeah, we have this token and we want to use it for staking in order for the value to appreciate, but at the same time we want to use it as a medium of exchange, right, in which we denominate the services that you pay for. But like, that is kind of tricky if you run into that issue, because the issue you run into is that obviously, if it's a staking token, the price will be volatile to some extent, right? And you usually don't want the price of your services to vary drastically between times, right? Because that leads to all sorts of issues for your customers, right? Particularly if you go more in the enterprise space, they want to have some assurance that they know what the price of the services that they want to use will be in the future, maybe over the next year or next couple of years, right? So that's an issue. But then, obviously, you can say like, hey, the price of our, even though it's denominated in the same token as we use for staking, right? The price denominated in that will fluctuate, right? So, but then you need a price oracle. You need to get the data from outside. Somebody saying like, oh, we denominated actually in US dollars, and get that price feed in, which comes with its own challenges, right? That a lot of startups struggle with. So,
like if you want to pay streamers, you don't want to pay, like no one wants to pay in a token that's going to go up in value. Like you want to incentivize viewers to pay streamers. And so you want to almost have it like that if you don't give it away, it's going to decrease in value.
Just sell them emotes. Like, sell them new icons to use in chat.
Yeah.
That's all the incentivization it seems that you need in practice. There's also kind of a broader question about like the economics and issuance and all of that of the parachain tokens. Like one of the kind of interesting things about and this is a space that I think is very, very cool to explore is I mentioned this a bunch in my Cumulus presentation, but the core thing to observe is that like usually when you have like a staking system, you're trying to collect a lot of money and you're trying to get like lots of money staked so that there's a lot on the line for slashing. And this is particularly to avoid safety failures, you know, if two things that are conflicting are finalized, that you can slash those who are responsible for doing that. But in the case of like collators in Polkadot, you're only really paying for liveness. So, you know, to incentivize liveness, you simply need some kind of incentivization. You don't necessarily need the strong disincentivization because liveness isn't something that you can like unequivocally prove. So that could point to having like parachain tokens, which are generally much more liquid, and perhaps lower issuance, lower inflation as well.
I have a pet theory that you could have a parachain that's proof of work and is only incentivized by transaction fees and nothing else.
I think because a lot of the fancy attacks that you can do, like all your fork-based attacks where you can reorganize history, you just simply can't do as a collator. Your chain that you're building on is handed to you, so you can't withhold. There's no opportunity to do that.
So moving on to another idea that I wanted to talk about, and then we can see if there's a raise of hands and if anyone has anything. So, and I know you are excited about this as well, which is infrastructure. So we all know Infura in the Ethereum world and like what they do, and they provide nodes and they provide APIs, and they're actually serving a massive amount of traffic, like 1 billion requests per day or some crazy number. And paying hundreds of thousands of dollars out of pocket for it. And it would be amazing if we could have a properly decentralized version of that, where like the other problem with Infura is that the data isn't verified. So whatever Infura tells you might be a lie. You have no idea to know. So if it's a properly verified and decentralized, incentivized infrastructure provider, that could solve so many of the problems, like the UX problems, the usability problems in general of what we see in blockchain today.
Yeah, I mean, this to me is something that comes in phases. So like one of the first things to me that's weird about like the existing Infura infrastructure is that I can ask Infura the same question twice and get 2 different answers. And you know, like, I don't think that this actually happens because they're not doing that, but their protocol is set up in such a way that it's just like HTTP requests. So I mean, they could tell you anything. And there are like, the reason blockchains like Ethereum and all substrate chains are designed with a state tree in mind is this idea that from the hash of a header, you can prove anything about the state cryptographically, and that, you know, there shouldn't be any reason to trust that you know, even if your first step is just, I'm always talking to the same centralized server to ask what I need, at the very least the centralized server should be proving to me that the answer that they are giving me makes sense.
That's true. Like even without decentralization, even without incentivization, they could still give you verifiable data. Yeah. And I think this is something that's kind of, it's easy to imagine a structure in which this works. Like you have full nodes that like open a payment channel with a light client, and the light client pays per request made to the full node. But then with payment channels, you're running into all these routing problems, and so like the question is, can this really work, or how do you build it out in a scalable way? Does it make sense for, you know, for individual people to run this and make money off of it, or is it still like a big player that has to run like 1,000 machines in a farm to actually profit from like economies of scale?
Yeah. I view this as a problem of on two aspects. So one is the light client servers themselves, and the other side of it is discovery of those servers. And if you're, for instance, working on a mobile phone, you probably don't have like you don't want to query the whole topology of the network and start to look for nodes and try to talk to them, set up state channels with them. On your mobile connection. But what you could do is probably have like a trusted service, which is basically connecting you to a market of people who want to serve information. And they can connect you to that and maybe even sort of fork off or forward a state channel payment where they're taking like a small cut for that in the middle. It's like, whatever business you do with this service, afterwards they can profit from that, but really they're only providing discovery. And then those who provide the service would do something, all they have to do is know the discovery service, and light clients will be automatically fed to them. This is, I think, a good model that can work in practice.
Are you guys ready? Do you have any ideas that you want to talk about? Yes.
Good. Oh, here, just one sec.
Going back to gaming, sorry going back, but I was really interested. I think when you go to gaming, you always talk about low latency, high, like small block time, consensus things, like Grandpa and Babe and stuff like that. What do you think do you think like lower than 1 second block times are possible? Do you think that we need different infrastructure, or do you think Substrate is built to handle these kinds of blockchains?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what you're essentially trying to avoid as much as possible is like round trip latency of any kind of agreement. So the idea that I've played with in the past, like the general concept, is like rather than handing off authorship privileges all the time or collecting sort of feedback on blocks all the time, what you would rather do is like assign authorship privileges for, like what we would do right now is you have a slot which is 4 seconds. You have 4 seconds to author a block, distribute it, whatever, right? What if you had 4 seconds to author 100 blocks, right? You don't need any feedback from anybody else to continue building on that chain. And probably the amount of time that it takes for those blocks to distribute means you're going to have small forks at the end of those 100 blocks, but you're not going to lose all the data. So you can go a bit more granular in this sense. And if you talk about gaming and sort of state channel style blockchains, where what you're probably doing is spinning up little ephemeral blockchains, I think that this avenue of research makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's many different types of games, right, where like if you're playing Magic the Gathering, you probably only need to trade the cards themselves on the chain. You don't need to like play out every game on chain. Like there's no real point to doing that. Whereas if you're playing like in a chess tournament, maybe you do want to play out every move on chain because like you're playing for money and it, like what moves are made actually counts. But like you're never gonna have like a 120 tick Counter-Strike server on like a blockchain. Like it doesn't make sense, and there's no need to. It's not that critical like that this frame is updated on a blockchain. So like those kinds of applications, like the Counter-Strike example is probably just never gonna happen. The chess one will probably go towards payment channels and stuff, and like the Magic the Gathering kind of game we can already do now.
To me, the ideal candidate is poker. So
yeah, so there's already some
because I love to gamble. And, no, but I think it's really cool because like one of the things that you have right now in like casinos and online casinos is this idea of the rake, right? Because they have to make money. So you're participating in some kind of pot with other players that you're competing over. Let's say you win $100. Casino might take 5 or 6, right? And that means that if you want to actually make money off of that, you have to win even more than the rake. But if you can do this in if you have like a good random multi-party computation where everybody can agree on the deck that was shuffled and prove that their cards came out of that deck and the communal cards that everybody saw also came out of that deck, you could build like extremely low rake or no rake casinos, and all of a sudden it would be like actually just a fair game of poker. It reverts to zero sum game as opposed to being a negative sum game.
And yeah, I think that's a good example because that is already built on Substrate and it's already built on Ethereum as well. And I think it's a good example. I mean, there are many, like even if I kind of, rag on casino stuff sometimes, and like I don't think you see it as the best use case of blockchain. There are many of those cases where, like poker, I think is the perfect one because it's a game amongst people. It's not just a game of chance, and so it's actually meaningful that you're removing this sort of middleman fee.
Are there any other ideas, questions, comments?
Anyone want to pitch their company?
Hi. Given that we don't really want to store everything on-chain, we're going to have some data that's clearly off-chain, some contextual data perhaps, and that contextual data needs to be sometimes queried. Are there any decentralized solutions for querying contextual data? We would normally use a traditional database to do that, but sort of things like IPFS don't really solve that problem. Are you aware of anything in that area?
I'm not. I mean, there are some projects. I mean, like Arweave is one that's Berlin-based as well that are trying to solve this. But you're basically, as I see it, you're basically asking for an IPFS that is incentivized and connected in a blockchain network. And the problem with the existing project is like none of them are really connected. So even though there exists like incentivized data storage networks, you can't really query them, and especially not from like an on-chain application. But if something connected to like Polkadot and you had your chain on Polkadot, then you could query it through Polkadot. That's certainly part of the vision that we have. And a file storage, like this kind of, I wouldn't necessarily, like it becomes questionable of like if there is a storage chain that stores things and in a sort of incentivized manner, you incentivize 5 nodes to store this thing. Is it stored off-chain? It's stored off-chain in the sense that not every full node stores it, but it's not stored off-chain as in IPFS world where you have no guarantee at all about anything regarding this data. So yeah, I think this is necessary for a healthy DApp ecosystem to actually exist.
Do you remember correctly that the graph was looking into some sort of these stuff? You might want to check that out.
Yeah, so the graph, yeah, I think they solve like the querying aspect of this.
Exactly.
They don't necessarily store the storage aspect of it, but I mean, one aspect is actually storing this data in a highly available, guaranteed way that is queryable, but then there's also like a query layer that needs to be figured out.
Yeah, basically, I mean, IPFS gives you some guarantees, right? The consistency guarantees to some extent, right? But like not availability ones.
It guarantees you that if you can download the data, it's correct. But it doesn't guarantee you that you can download the data.
Yeah.
Any other ideas, thoughts, questions?
After 2018, we saw that people don't give about tokens and crypto extensions in browser, and just mass adoption just failed in 2018. So why should people care about tokens, crypto plugins for browsers, and all other geeky stuff in 2020? And what are the ways to tackle all these things? So people can use it like not just 2 million of crypto guys, but at least 100 million or something.
Thanks.
I mean, this is really just dependent on the use case, isn't it? And we've come a long way since 2018, especially in 2017, especially just because like now you have things like stable coins, right? And now you have much more scalable platforms where somebody can actually they don't have to deal with what are all of the blockchain internals in order to use it. And then it's like a lot of it is really just a question of like how do you funnel users into the on-ramps, right? And we were talking about something relatively related to this. just before, this idea of the cashback systems. Maybe you can explain it a bit better.
Basically, so like one of the challenges we obviously have towards adoption is how do we get crypto, how do we get the average Joe familiar with crypto in one way or another, right? That this kind of asset exists, that you can use it, and so forth, right? And currently, one of the big hurdles is obviously the on-ramp, right? Like, how do I get started? Do I have to sign up for an exchange, Coinbase, whatever, buy some crypto, local Bitcoins? It's like pretty bad today, right? It's a lot of effort to get there. And one very simple idea that, you know, seems to get some traction is the idea of creating cashback apps, right? Very Web 2 world-like, or even Web 0.1. The basic idea is you go to a store, right? You have a company, a cashback company that makes deals with retailers and say like, hey, we bring you customers. Therefore, if our customer goes there and shows this app, right, they get 10%, 20%, 1%, whatever, of the price of the product back as cashback, right? And you, as a company, convert it to crypto and give the person, the buyer, the cashback in crypto, just so that they have crypto without having to buy it, right? And like the next step is obviously you make them, you enable them to use that wallet and that crypto in the same stores or potentially even other stores to spend it, just to get it going, right? To get to have customers get their hands on crypto. That's one thing, very, very straightforward, and I think that should exist. It exists in the Bitcoin ecosystem with Fold app, you might know it. But yeah, we have to see how far that brings us. At the end of the day, you're right, we need applications that are exciting, right? That people get passionate about, that really get traction, that work. But I think one of that brings us to a bit of a different issue, right? We have the challenges on the user side, getting traction, building good apps. But on the other hand, we also have a challenge where we have all these companies and startups that struggle with monetizing and capturing value through their app, right? So if we go back to this great example you brought with the poker app, right? Sure, you know, you can have people build a poker, like a casino, that is a zero-sum game rather than a negative-sum game, right? But how is a developer going to make money, right? Like, you know, he's not going to do that just in a philanthropic way for all of his life. He's got to make some money, right? And the issue that we have seen in these Creative Commons that blockchains are is that there's very little lock-in for users, right? So if I build this poker app, as all of you know, right, it's open source, I deploy it, I can obviously introduce a fee, but then maybe somebody else comes, another developer, just copy-paste, cuts out the fee, and then, you know, I lose most of my users probably because the lock-in is not high enough. And I think that is a challenge that we as a space, as an overall space, have to tackle sooner or later. But and you know, that's an area I've been fairly passionate about, because I think in the long run that really matters for us to all be successful and for this space to work out. And I think one of the opportunities that we see coming is with the emergence of systems like Polkadot, where you have treasuries. So where you have these systems, these public, decentralized, permissionless systems, right, that control money, a treasury, and that can vote on using that money to spend it on something that, you know, potentially creates more value for the overall community, such as, for example, an infrastructure piece or a poker app whatsoever. We can foresee a future where, you know, an ecosystem pays a developer or a company to bring a piece of software to that ecosystem. But and there are some interesting ideas floating around. We're looking into stuff, for example, creating like a custom license, right, where you publish your code, and not in open source fashion, but you offer your code to a blockchain, basically your product to a blockchain ecosystem, and you. For example, in a decentralized, permissionless way, where you have a smart contract saying like, hey, you know, if that amount of dots or like money goes into that smart contract, this following license that is in that contract goes into effect, and everyone connected to, or like everyone in the Polkadot ecosystem, another ecosystem, can use that app under the license that's published, right? So, and that would be a way to enable maybe companies and developers to monetize their contributions. And the same could count for patents, right? But that's still like kind of new territory with lots of legal hurdles, but it can be done. And I think like you might know Starkware out there, the company Starkware, trying to innovate in the zero knowledge space, and they kind of went a bit in this direction by saying like, oh, we do tech for tokens, right? But they don't enter an agreement with an open ecosystem. Who they enter into an agreement with is really like a legal entity, such as the Ethereum Foundation, right? Which said like, hey, this technology would be great for our ecosystem. Here you have a grant, you get money, you build that for us, right? But we want to get to a point where you don't need that entity, and maybe the treasury, a DAO, can enter these kind of agreements.
All right, we have a question over here.
Yeah, as a follow-up from the question about like the difference between 2018 and 2020, why do you think that we are still concentrating on consumer applications and no one is really looking at corporate or business-to-business solution in areas like, I don't know, logistic, pharmaceuticals, something that may expand to a kind of different work from what the community has been working now?
I wouldn't say that that's true. I'd say there's tons and tons of people who are looking at corporate interests, and especially those that you mentioned, pharmaceuticals, logistics, like private data management, and all these other things. The problem is that they usually don't become open systems, right? They don't become public blockchains because it's not in the interest of those corporations to do so. But I think there's ample opportunity to try to bridge these two worlds where we have a ton of private blockchains that deal with these things, but how do we make the data accessible, or how do we like gain value from them as a society and as an open ecosystem? And it's kind of hard because like it's a case-by-case basis where maybe they could connect to a public network and provide like a zero-knowledge proof saying, yes, this person is insured or this person has healthcare or whatever it may be, without revealing more information. But like what makes sense in that world? What makes sense to connect or not connect? Like really, we're just on the cusp of this world where it's even possible to connect to anything.
Cool.
Yeah, I would also say, like alone today, I spoke to 3 projects in this room that are catering to the enterprise market, right? Their customers will be enterprises. So that is certainly a thing that's coming, but I think it's just naturally, and like if you look at these technology adoption cycles, right? Enterprises or more established institutions are usually just late adopters, right? They wait and see, they see how that pans out. They have different requirements towards the stability of software, right? They can't cope with what you've been coping with over the last couple of months with Substrate, right? They wouldn't do that. So it will come, it will take some time, but I strongly believe it will come at some point.
Are there any other ideas? This is sort of like wish list ideas or things that you kind of would like to see on the horizon. I actually have one. Can I ask? It involves zero knowledge. You just mentioned these zero knowledge proofs. Is there anything that like Substrate, Polkadot, do they enable certain like special forms of privacy technology or the use of zero knowledge proofs? Could you do a privacy chain?
I think, well, one thing that's really interesting to me is the idea of like we have these parachain validation functions in Polkadot, and like on the horizon, it may not be zero knowledge, but it's very similar. The idea of succinct proofs, which is a property that a lot of zero knowledge proofs have. It's possible to make succinct proofs that are not zero knowledge, but it's usually just a small tweak to make them into a zero knowledge proof after that. And the idea is like we're passing like a bunch of witness data, like proof that a state transition is valid, but it's just like a bulky proof. It's like all the data that you would need to read a transaction. There's no real reason why, at least in theory, you could not pass just a succinct proof of this and scale things up a ton.
what I'd say is like with the problem with zero knowledge tech, and part of like why it's not as applied in the blockchain world as I think it should be, is that it requires you to like hyper specialize in the way you design a blockchain. So, you know, Zcash is not just another module in Bitcoin, because like it required so much more out of the node than what Bitcoin could provide, or what Bitcoin would consider acceptable to include as code. So that's why it's a different project. And if you're trying to do zero knowledge proofs on Ethereum, for instance, it's just not possible. The elliptic curve crypto is just not supported on the chain. So then, yeah, people are starting to like fork Ethereum and like build in their own stuff all the time. And this is just like not an ergonomic way to work with this stuff. You don't want to like have to build a new blockchain every time you want to introduce a new type of proof. And so I think Substrate helps with this, where you can just include like the Rust code for the proof in your runtime, and it works. You can just like we don't suffer the same constraints as Ethereum, where you know this needs to be a precompile that needs to be agreed by an EIP, whatever. You can just build it, and so like that's sort of my hope, that you know once blockchain frameworks exist and they're flexible enough to just include the code, that more of this will happen.
And luckily, most of new zero knowledge stuff is all implemented in Rust.
Yeah, it's a bonus.
Are there any other ideas? Oh.
What about a kind of a point-and-click process for smart contract design and also blockchain design? So you've got like a WYSIWYG kind of interface, and you can just drop them.
Yeah, so that's an excellent idea, and that's something we're very passionate around. We really want to make happen around Substrate, particularly not only on smart contracts, but like runtime development, right? So I think, I don't know who you spoke about it earlier today. The playground, right, is part of our efforts to make this onboarding experience just great, right? So you don't have to wait like an hour until your environment is set up. You just go on a website and you play around with it. You have this runtime module template. You don't have to wait for compilation. You can play around with it, and great, right? But so far, it's still you have to write the code. You can't just say like, oh, I go on a website, I see here are all the modules that I can plug in or not, and these are the ones that work together with. But we're slowly getting there, right? So one of my colleagues who might be here, Steve, he's been working, for example, on this CLI tool, right, that would just allow you to type a command, which is basically add runtime module, and it plugs into your runtime, and you can test it, right? And the next step is just making it visually pleasing, having an interface where you can mix and match those. But that's definitely something that we are actively working on as well. But we always appreciate contributors. So if you are more passionate about that than us, please go ahead. We help you build that.
Yeah, I think you can also go one level higher, and there's a great idea in the Polkadot ecosystem, which is basically the same thing, which is like, let's say, and you could take this extremely far, right? And I think that this is one of the places where like a hybrid visual/code editor can be very, very productive and actually fits. So like, let's say you're developing a parachain or some application that bridges across many chains. Like what if you want to use parachain A and parachain B, and you have components living on both? So like imagine if you have some kind of editor where you have like a relay chain in the middle, and you can just kind of drag and drop, and you say, okay, there's going to be like parachain A, there's going to be parachain B, we have like connection here, we have this smart contract living here. And you just press play, and it generates all the spec files and just spins this up on your computer, and that's pretty much it. And you can plug all the code in. I think this is like something that when you're trying to reason about like what we're entering right now is like a new phase where nobody knows what like a cross-chain development environment will look like, right? So there's so much space for exploration there, but it's like a time for a very new category and new style of tools.
I just wanted to say that like for the marketplace, that I was talking about before with like modules, I think that's super simple, right? The runtime modules, you just go, yeah, these compose well, you can click and choose, and then it builds a runtime for you, and that's your starting point. But I don't know if like, how many people here have actually done graphical programming, but it's generally a really shitty experience. So there's this whole subworld in research where, I can't remember the name of this, but I used to do a bunch of it at uni where you connect a bunch of sensors to a computer and then you do graphical programming to like read these sensors and do various things, like control theory stuff based on what happens. And it's such a bad experience. And I think it's in part because programming in general, like Turing-complete programming, is too complex to visualize graphically. So if you're talking about like graphical programming for smart contracts, generally, I don't think it makes sense. But when it comes to smart contracts, the thing is, I have a relatively controversial opinion that smart contracts should not be Turing-complete. So there's a general, like, you may want to have components like zero-knowledge proofs or whatever that is like one component in your workflow. But for your normal sort of business logic, when you enter into a space of smart contracts that look more like legal contracts, you really don't want to be able to do anything. You want it to be a constrained state machine where you know what states you can exist in and how you go from these different states. And I've seen graphical programming environments and programming languages for programming state machines, and those are actually pretty impressive. And they give you like your whole program in one slide, and it goes, here's all the things, and here's all the states that you could possibly enter into, and you can kind of formally prove that you're never going to end up in a state that you don't want to be into. So I think there's a lot of potential there and a lot of power, but we need to know how to like bridge this gap between this ideal world where we know exactly what the state machine is that we were dealing with and general programming, which is where we are now.
Cool. There's a few questions now. I've just seen a few hands go up. You put your hand up, right? You put your hand up, and you had a quick one. So I think we only have about 12 minutes left, so I'm going to be a little fast with this. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a quick one. So it's not a concrete idea, but I think a design space that's pretty heavily underexplored among substrate builders is the concept of para-threads. Essentially, it's essentially the same thing as a parachain, but instead of like you put a bunch of dots down to get full throughput, you pay as you go. And that's quite interesting if you don't need much throughput. Most substrate development teams I've talked to, if they think about connecting to Polkadot, they talk about parachains, and this is also the more known kind of like concept of connecting. I don't think I know any team that really thinks seriously about building a para-thread or connecting as a para-thread. But just thinking about what are impactful chains you can build on something like Substrate that only progress once a week or once a month or even less than that, I think is a pretty interesting area to explore.
Yes.
Agreed.
All right, thanks. You had your hand up?
So speaking of innovation and also regulation, what do you think about like the stance of Germany in this aspect, and also with a new like sort of blockchain act here in the country? And I'm also curious about how do you chose to establish yourself here, and what do you think about sort of the positioning of Germany in Europe and just in general?
The reason we're here is because Gab liked this cafe that accepted Bitcoin, so it's not really reasoned around legally.
We liked it too.
You had your hand up?
Yeah, I actually don't know anything about regulatory situations, so I can't really speak about it. But generally, this is all super uncertain, and like I feel like no one actually knows what's going on in legal land.
I mean, we've seen that the government and the regulator becomes a bit more progressive here and is willing to experiment with it, pumping a bit of money into experiments, right? We ourselves, Parity Tech, is engaging themselves in a few projects. One person that I would stand out, who's probably here, who's probably a good person to talk to, is Ingo from Kilt. He can give you a good rundown where the government currently stands and what their opinion is. Happy to
Last
connect
question
you.
over here.
Yeah, there
or-
was, but I don't. Do you still want to ask a question? Oh, do you want to say it anyway? No.
It was just about the graphical. It was about the graphical programming. If you've seen the latest versions of Unreal Engine, they have like these really cool states and flow of the program, and you could see everything.
I haven't seen the latest versions, but I have seen versions of it, and I know what you're talking about. That starts to look a lot like what I'm talking about, yeah. I've seen, so there has been experiments in smart contract land to do stuff like this, but I've just never seen anyone take it all the way and actually try to build, production-ready stuff for it.
To me, this is like the happy medium. I'm like a big fan of how game engines are typically set up. It's like you have a visual component which serves as guidelines. You program imperatively under the hood. It's a very happy balance if you can do it right.
How we can prevent formation of cartels within the Polkadot network?
Ooh.
I mean, this is a general topic, right? How do you prevent cartels in any blockchain? The same goes for Bitcoin. There's 5 miners. How do we know that they're not actually a cartel? I don't know. It's a really hard question.
I mean, the question is really a lot about what can cartels get away with, right? So, like, certain sizes of cartels can get away with safety failures. That would be like very bad, but it would also be in the real world, in practical terms, spotted very quickly. Like they may not be slashed, but it may also invalidate the system that they're using, and people would cease to use it. But yeah, I mean, this is just a question of like the economic models that people are using, and it is very clear that Byzantine fault tolerance is not like a sufficient description of the real world. But at the same time, like we're building real systems, and there are going to be like realistic considerations about how those systems are going to function.
A couple of ideas. One for a friend company. They kind of need a decentralized exchange, similar to what was mentioned at the beginning. They were thinking about using Stellar for this. It would be cool, like Stellar on Polkadot. And the other idea is, would be cool to hear, like brainstorming. I work on the autonomous mobility industry. So getting a decentralized fleet of robo drivers and normal drivers to agree with each other who's gonna pick up whom, how is this gonna work, would be cool to hear ideas about it.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought a lot about the robo driver kind of situation, and there's a cool sci-fi future that we can imagine where every car is autonomous, drives itself, is connected to a blockchain. You could have real-time auctions that sort of, you have no traffic lights. It's just when you enter into an intersection, you have an auction between all the cars that would crash with each other, and I'm the highest bidder, so I get to go first. There's a lot of cool stuff. There's a lot of like dystopia in there too. So it's I don't know how far we can get, but I mean, we've been in talks with car companies, and there is actual real interest in putting blockchain nodes in cars. For now, it's like an IoT space kind of thing where they want to gather metrics or want to do, kind of benign things that doesn't really need a blockchain. But eventually, doing things like, a decentralized Uber kind of thing, I guess, would be like a use case for this where you're actually measuring what the car is doing, who's interacting with it, like make a blockchain transfer and it opens the door for you and takes you where you want to go. So I think it's doable.
I mean, in particular, the decentralized or the autonomous aspect of this is very interesting because, like, one of the main things that Uber is providing is a reputation service of drivers. Whereas, if you can show somehow that like a car has been signed by a particular manufacturer, by a particular software firm, something like that, has designed the operation of the car, you can kind of remove this reputational aspect, which brings it a lot closer to the forefront of what can be done now.
Again, about mass adoption, I believe that native support of signing transactions within browser or mobile phones is a very good step into this. Any discussions or partnership with browser producers like Opera, Mozilla, or with hardware providers like Samsung?
Hardware providers, yes. Browser providers, I've only talked to Brave, which are keen to integrate this, but the other ones I think are too big to care about blockchain at this point. And I think that goes to the general point of mass adoption. I don't think that this market, this ecosystem is ready for mass adoption. I don't think this is a goal that we should try to have. We should, we're way earlier than that. I think the goal should be to build useful applications at all, and get any adoption. We shouldn't try to get mass adoption before we have any adoption. Like the internet in the 70s didn't have 100 million users. We shouldn't expect to just jump in straight away at 100 million. So it's we need to take baby steps before we can run here. And to some degree, the tech isn't ready. The tech in the whole world, in the space, isn't ready for mass adoption. But to some degree, it's also like a social thing. People don't adapt that fast. There's a human aspect, and we can only change our lives and change our world at a certain pace. And it's not going to go from no blockchain to all blockchain in a year or two.
To that end, right, I want to follow up on what Rob said earlier, where we said, hey, where do we stand today? Well, we've built applications on single-sharded blockchains so far. Now we're getting to these multi-shard blockchain system. And, for the first time, we're really exposed to this possibility to build an application across shards, right? And then we get to this point where we start oh, maybe I plug in this parachain because it gives me that, and this parachain. But if you take that a lot further, eventually, hopefully we will arrive at a highly integrated experience where I don't even care about the parachains at all, but I say oh, I need reputation, I need a payment rail, and I need X, Y, Z, right, in my application, and I build it together and done. And I don't care about which specific parachain it builds on, right?
That's interesting. By the way, we can hear the background is getting a little louder. Drinks and food is coming soon, but I think we have one or two more questions.
You can do a raise of hands. Who wants to get drinks?
A few of you. Okay, I think there was one thing here.
So, Gav has spoken from time to time about how eventually these chains will be autonomous economic entities, and the people driving the chain, those involved in governance, might say, hey, there's this other chain out there with some cool tech that I like, or maybe there's this other chain out there that I don't like. Vote chain A, go acquire chain B, and either attach it to my chain so I can use its tech or dump it in the bin. What needs to be built to make that possible?
Or impossible.
I think to completely autonomously acquire another chain, the other chain also needs to be built with the same sort of interfaces. The APIs need to be consistent enough that that's actually possible. But if you're talking about acquire in terms of find a development team who is actually able to build in the features over there, or pay off enough miners to actually reroute stuff, then I think you could already do that today. There's no real stopping you.
The question is really about you can't kill a blockchain forever. This is kind of the point. Is somebody's gonna fork the node software, and it's gonna even if you've bricked one version of the chain, that may keep running. The idea is mostly to capture as much of the community as possible. So that they do not follow onto that minority fork anymore. And you've sort of removed a bunch of the utility of it. I could imagine there are kind of clever things that you could do with governance systems where you can force a chain to brick itself, but everybody who participated in the vote can use a Merkle proof to claim some new issuance of tokens elsewhere. That's one scheme. In terms of actually but that's more of the question of like how do you brick or like economically attack another chain, just put a price on it. The other question is like how do you acquire a chain, and I'm not really sure exactly what acquisition of a chain means, but like
forcibly connected to Polkadot.
Well, there are multiple aspects, right? Like you could say one aspect is the tech part, right? I want to buy the technology that this chain is running, and today most of public blockchains are open source, right? Often permissively licensed, so you don't really need to buy it. You can just copy paste
this
it.
licensing stuff.
Exactly. Maybe in the future that's not the case anymore, and we actually have a way to, assign certain IP to chains, right? So buying the tech is one thing. The other one is, as you said, is like kind of buying the ecosystem, like telling the users and developers to transition and merge. And for that, really, you just have to find a way to incentivize these people, right? And for all of that to work, you need good working governance mechanisms, right? That are implemented and, people trust.
Cool. I think, how do you guys feel? Do you want to do one more? Are you ready?
I could go all night. This is my life. This is what I work with.
Okay, we'll keep going a little bit.
Well, it's maybe a follow-up question to that. What do you think would happen if a parachain outgrows the relay chain in terms of capitalization? What is the kind of the economy that, or I mean, kind of not buying another chain like you argued now, but what would happen to the security of all of Polkadot if one parachain kind of is dominant?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it boils down, like there's this notion of like minor extractable value, which is like if there were to be an attack, how much value could they extract from it? And this is like, there's lots of different ways to do that. You can take short positions, you can cause absolute chaos and profit from that. There's lots of different approaches. And then there's a question of like practical like extractable value. So probably like if you do an attack, you're not going to be attacking absolutely everything at once. And it may not actually be possible for you to mount an attack on like, for instance, all value across all parachains. So this kind of provides like a lower bound of like, as soon as the total like theoretical extractable value matches the, like let's say the security parameter of the chain, then you can, probably start to expect some attacks. I mean, this is just one of the more unsolved problems of blockchains in general. We're hoping that the governance stuff, the ability to then apply, like for instance, reversions or things like that in the case of like an extraordinarily odd or rare attack, that you can deter these kinds of things as well.
Cool. So I think we actually need to wrap up because there will be food and a party happening very soon. All these chairs are going to be moved out, but you're welcome to stay around the space. Let's give a hand to these awesome panelists. And thank you for your questions.
Thank you.